That request would require generating a book-length story that far exceeds what I can produce in a single response. Instead, I can write it in serialized parts while keeping the plot, characters, timeline, and style consistent across installments. Here is part 1, ending at a natural turning point. When you reply continue, I'll continue directly from that moment in the same style and without restarting the story. Once, before kings carved their names into stone and before sailors trusted the stars more than the gods, there lived a man called Odin, a quiet laborer whose shoulders seemed permanently bent beneath years of disappointment, whose boots were always coated with dust, and whose reputation in the mountain city of Verald was worth less than the cracked pottery discarded outside the market walls. Every morning the same whispers followed him through narrow streets lined with slate roofs and smoking chimneys. Lazy. Worthless. A burden. Some laughed openly while others simply shook their heads as though his existence confirmed every fear they carried about wasted potential. Children copied their parents and mimicked his slow walk before bursting into laughter, while merchants rolled their eyes whenever he paused to examine goods he could never afford. None of them noticed the strange calm that never left his face. They believed it belonged to a defeated man, but defeat had never truly lived inside him. It was merely another disguise. 5 years earlier, beneath a crimson sky split by impossible lightning, Odin had stood on a battlefield where mortals could not survive. The air had smelled of iron and burning cedar while creatures woven from shadow crawled across broken earth toward a single wounded knight surrounded by corpses. The knight, Lord Edric Halvar, had raised his shattered sword one final time despite knowing death had already chosen him. Then a stranger descended through the storm without wings, without horse, and without fear. Every step he took cracked the stones beneath his feet. His eyes burned like molten gold before dimming into ordinary gray the instant they met the dying nobleman's gaze. The creatures lunged together. The battle lasted only moments. To mortal eyes it would have appeared as flashes of silver crossing impossible distances, but when silence returned, the monsters lay scattered across the valley like leaves after a hurricane. Lord Edric, barely breathing, asked the stranger's name. I have carried many, the warrior answered. The one I use least is Kale, son of Odin. The nobleman's trembling expression shifted from gratitude to disbelief because every child knew legends of Odin's bloodline. They were not simply warriors. They were eternal guardians whose names disappeared from history whenever they chose to walk among humanity. Edric attempted to kneel despite his wounds, but Kale stopped him with a gentle hand. Do not worship me. Live. The nobleman survived because the immortal carried him across half a kingdom to healers before vanishing into mist. Years passed. Lord Edric died peacefully of old age surrounded by family, yet before taking his final breath he called upon the ancient promise known only to those who had glimpsed the hidden world. If ever my bloodline falls into darkness, he whispered toward the empty room, let my debt be repaid. The words crossed oceans, mountains, and realms until they reached golden halls beyond mortal sight. Kale heard them. He remembered the desperate knight who had refused to abandon his soldiers even while facing impossible death. Honor demanded payment. Odin himself granted permission. Protect his descendants, the Allfather declared. But remember. Mortal gratitude fades. Mortal pride grows. You may not reveal yourself unless your vow ends. Kale accepted without hesitation. Thus the immortal descended once more, hiding his strength, his name, and his divine heritage beneath the ordinary face of Aldrin, an unemployed wanderer carrying little more than worn clothing and tired eyes. Lord Edric's descendants had changed greatly. Wealth remained, but dignity had become fragile. The Halvar estate stood on the edge of financial ruin because rival houses circled like wolves waiting for weakness. The family believed marriage to a harmless outsider would prevent dangerous political alliances until their fortunes recovered. Aldrin volunteered before anyone else could. They welcomed him only because they believed no respectable man would accept their daughter under such uncertain circumstances. Her name was Ilara. She possessed striking dark hair, intelligent blue eyes, and enough determination to frighten experienced merchants during negotiations. On the day of their wedding she looked at her new husband without affection or hatred. Only resignation filled her voice. I hope you understand this changes nothing. Aldrin smiled faintly. It was never meant to. She interpreted his answer as surrender rather than kindness. Their marriage became a quiet performance observed by everyone around them. Ilara managed estate accounts, negotiated trade agreements, comforted servants, and carried every visible burden while Aldrin accepted the smallest jobs imaginable. He repaired fences, carried grain, chopped wood, and disappeared for long stretches claiming to search unsuccessfully for employment. Whenever money entered the household, it came through Ilara's efforts. Her mother, Lady Miriam, reminded everyone of that fact almost daily. If our daughter had married someone worthy, this family would already be thriving, she declared during dinners while deliberately placing the smallest portion beside Aldrin. Her younger son Rowan copied her contempt with youthful arrogance. Perhaps brother Aldrin spent another afternoon studying clouds. It sounds exhausting. Laughter usually followed. Aldrin laughed too, which somehow irritated them even more because insults lost satisfaction when the target refused anger. Only old servant Brenna occasionally watched him with narrowed eyes. She had lived through enough seasons to recognize that truly broken men carried bitterness differently. Once, while Aldrin repaired a cracked stable door, Brenna quietly handed him fresh bread. "You smile too easily," she observed. "People who suffer usually don't." He thanked her before answering. Some burdens become lighter when nobody else has to carry them. She frowned, sensing layers beneath his words, but respected his silence. Unknown to everyone inside the estate, each insult paid another piece of an invisible debt. Each night after the household slept, Aldrin became someone entirely different. Moonlight reflected from rivers as he crossed impossible distances without leaving footprints. Bandits who planned attacks on Halvar caravans vanished before sunrise. Corrupt officials accepting bribes woke unable to remember why they had suddenly changed their decisions. Mercenary captains abandoned profitable contracts after terrifying dreams of wolves with burning eyes hunted them across endless forests. Rumors spread through neighboring kingdoms about an unseen guardian protecting House Halvar, but nobody connected those legends to the quiet husband mocked over breakfast. One autumn evening a caravan carrying medicine toward the Halvar estate entered Black Pine Pass where dozens of armed raiders waited above narrow cliffs. Their leader grinned as wagons rolled directly beneath carefully prepared boulders. A single signal would bury everyone below. Before he could raise his hand, wind roared through the canyon although the trees stood perfectly still. Something landed among the bandits without warning. The first raider saw only gray eyes glowing briefly like sunlight reflected from polished steel. The second heard bones breaking before realizing the sound came from his own weapon snapping in half. Others fired arrows that froze in midair for one impossible heartbeat before falling harmlessly into dust. Panic replaced confidence. Men fled in every direction only to discover every escape blocked by shadows moving faster than sight itself. Their leader finally found courage to shout, "Who are you?" The stranger answered while lifting an entire boulder with one hand and placing it gently back onto solid ground as though it weighed no more than a child. "Someone collecting an old debt." By dawn every surviving bandit had surrendered to royal guards, each insisting an ancient spirit haunted the mountains. The caravan reached the Halvar estate safely. Ilara praised the guards for their efficiency, never realizing they had arrived only after danger had already ended. Winter followed with unforgiving storms. Food became scarce throughout the region, and neighboring nobles secretly discussed seizing Halvar lands before desperation forced surrender. Among them stood Lord Kashinvas, a charismatic ruler whose polished manners concealed relentless ambition. Unlike louder rivals, Kashin preferred patience. He smiled while offering assistance, then quietly purchased debts until entire families belonged to him without realizing it. During a formal gathering he approached Ilara with practiced warmth. "Your husband chose not to accompany you?" She answered with visible embarrassment. "He dislikes celebrations." Kashin laughed softly. "Or perhaps celebrations dislike him." Nearby nobles joined the amusement. Ilara forced a polite smile despite feeling unexpectedly uncomfortable. She disliked Aldrin's passivity, yet hearing strangers ridicule him stirred irritation she had not expected. Later that evening she returned home to find him asleep beside the fireplace, his hands rough from labor, soot staining his sleeves. She stood watching him longer than necessary before whispering almost involuntarily, "You make it impossible to understand you."
Aldrin opened his eyes immediately because immortals never truly slept. Did something happen? Nothing important. Then why are you troubled? She hesitated before answering. People mock you everywhere. They've earned that right.
No one earns the right to humiliate another.
He smiled gently. You defended me? She looked away. I tolerated them less than usual. Thank you.
The simplicity of his gratitude unsettled her more than anger would have.
Days turned into months. Seasons changed again. Beneath ordinary routines, invisible wars continued.
Strange beasts crossed into the mortal realm through forgotten ruins.
Cultists sought relics capable of opening permanent gateways between worlds.
Each threat moved toward lands connected to House Halvar, and each disappeared before reaching its destination.
One rainy night Aldrin tracked a monstrous wolf larger than any horse through abandoned catacombs beneath Verald.
Ancient runes glowed faintly across damp walls while echoes carried distant growls impossible to judge by direction alone.
The beast emerged suddenly, its fur woven from darkness itself, 6 crimson eyes studying him with unnatural intelligence. Instead of drawing a weapon, Aldrin sighed. You chose the wrong valley.
The creature lunged.
Stone exploded beneath its claws.
Mortals would have seen only violent chaos, but beneath the earth 2 immortal forces collided with enough strength to fracture pillars supporting entire chambers.
Aldrin caught the monster's jaws with both hands before twisting sideways, sending the enormous body crashing through solid rock. The beast recovered instantly, releasing black fire that melted ancient carvings into glowing liquid. Aldrin finally abandoned restraint. Golden light erupted beneath his skin.
Invisible thunder echoed through tunnels although no storm existed above. One strike of his fist shattered the monster's armor-like skull. The remaining darkness dissolved into ash carried away by silent wind. His divine radiance faded moments later. By sunrise he returned home carrying ordinary firewood, arriving just in time for Lady Miriam to complain that he had once again disappeared without explanation.
Perhaps next time, she snapped, you'll remember husbands actually belong with their families. Aldrin bowed his head apologetically. You're right. Ilara watched from across the room.
For reasons she could not explain.
Disappointment replaced satisfaction.
She had expected excuses. Instead she found humility so complete it almost seemed impossible. The 5th year of the vow approached slowly, marked not by celebrations but by growing tension across kingdoms. Lord Cashin's influence expanded until neighboring estates quietly accepted his protection.
Merchants vanished after refusing unfair contracts. Witnesses changed testimony unexpectedly.
Entire villages awoke owing taxes they had never agreed to pay. House Halvar stood increasingly isolated, yet every attempt to destroy them failed through accidents so improbable that whispers of divine intervention spread among common folk. Cashin refused to believe in miracles.
Find me the hidden protector, he ordered his most trusted commander. Everyone bleeds.
I simply need to discover where. Far beyond mortal sight, across bridges woven from starlight and towers crowned with eternal flame, a horn sounded through golden halls where warriors who had never known death paused their endless training. Odin sat upon his throne surrounded by ravens whose eyes reflected every realm at once.
Beside.
Traveled farther than any weapon, farther than any army, farther than any command ever issued by a king.
It crossed oceans, mountains, worlds, and the invisible paths between realms.
It reached places where no divine messenger had ever gone.
It reached civilizations that had never heard the name Odin.
It reached people who believed themselves completely alone. And everywhere it arrived, something unexpected happened.
People answered. Not because they understood the danger. Most did not. They did not know about the first echo. They did not understand the ancient forces moving beneath reality.
They did not know that gods were afraid or that the foundation of existence itself had begun to tremble.
They only knew that something was wrong.
They saw strange lights in the sky. They felt the earth hum beneath their feet. They watched familiar stars disappear and unfamiliar ones appear. And when the message came that every realm needed to stand together, they chose to listen. In Asgard, preparations began immediately.
But this was not like any war council in history. There were no maps of enemy armies. No predictions of battlefield movements. No lists of weapons powerful enough to change the outcome. Because the enemy was not approaching from outside. It was already woven into everything.
The greatest warriors of Asgard struggled with that idea. For centuries, their purpose had been simple.
Find danger. Defeat danger. Protect the realms. But how did one defeat a memory? How did one fight a wound?
How did one raise a sword against something that had never held a sword at all? In the training fields beneath the Golden Towers, thousands of soldiers gathered. Many expected Kale to command them. Many expected him to stand before them wearing divine armor and carrying the greatest weapon in Asgard. Instead, he arrived wearing the same simple clothes he had worn on Midgard.
The sight confused them. A young warrior whispered to another, "Is that all he brought?"
The older warrior beside him answered quietly, "He brought himself."
Kale stepped onto the central platform. The conversations faded. He looked across the assembled army. Generals. Kings. Guardians.
Young warriors who had never seen real battle. Beings who had lived thousands of years and still feared what came next. "I know what many of you are thinking," Kale said. His voice carried across the entire field. "You believe the thing we face is powerful because it has existed since the beginning."
No one moved.
"You believe it cannot be reasoned with because it has no heart."
A pause. "You believe it must be destroyed because destruction is the only answer we understand." Some warriors looked away. Because those thoughts had been present in every mind. Kale continued. "But we have tried that." The wind moved through the field. "We fought it." A golden banner behind him moved. "We trapped it." Another banner stirred. "We buried it." His eyes moved across the army. And every time, it returned. Silence. Because we misunderstood what it was. A warrior near the front stepped forward. "You are saying we should trust the thing trying to erase existence?" Kale looked at him. "No." The warrior waited. "We should understand it before deciding how to face it." The warrior shook his head. "That sounds like weakness." Kale nodded. "Many people mistake understanding for surrender." He looked toward the distant sky. "They are not the same."
A murmur moved through the soldiers.
Then Kale said something that surprised everyone. "The first echo is not the strongest enemy we have ever faced." The warriors listened. "It is the loneliest."
The words settled over them.
Even the skeptical ones became quieter. Because everyone understood loneliness. Not the same way. Not equally. But enough.
A soldier who had lost a brother. A queen who had buried children.
A traveler who had left home.
A god who had watched centuries pass.
Everyone carried some version of it. Kale lowered his voice.
And loneliness becomes dangerous when it convinces itself that nothing matters. The field remains silent.
So when we face it, we cannot answer with more hatred. A warrior frowned. "What do we answer with?" Kale looked at him. "Proof." "Proof of what?" "That suffering did not make us meaningless."
The words traveled across the field. That loss did not erase what came before.
That endings do not destroy beginnings. No one cheered. No one raised weapons. Something quieter happened. They listened.
And sometimes listening was the beginning of change. Far below Asgard, in the mortal world, Lyra stood at the edge of the shining valley.
The ancient stone circle was no longer smooth. Lines of golden and black energy moved across its surface like rivers.
Scientists had arrived from across the world.
Historians. Engineers. Researchers.
People who had spent their entire lives explaining the universe through measurements and equations.
Now they stood beneath impossible skies watching those explanations collapse.
A scientist named Dr. Elias Van approached Lyra while studying the readings from his equipment.
Your family records predicted this? Lyra shook her head. Not exactly. What did they predict? She looked toward the valley. That someone would have to choose.
Elias adjusted his glasses.
Choose what? She thought about Kale. About the first echo. About the centuries of secrets.
Whether existence is worth the pain that comes with it. The scientist stared at her.
That is a very philosophical answer. It is a very dangerous question. He looked at the sky. Do you think your ancestor knew? Lyra smiled faintly. She knew more than most people. Ilara? Yes. What kind of person was she? Lyra looked toward the old oak tree.
My family wrote thousands of pages about her.
She paused.
But the most important thing was only one sentence.
What sentence? Lyra answered softly.
She loved someone who everyone else misunderstood.
The scientist looked at her. And that changed everything? Lyra nodded. Yes. Above them, the sky opened. Not like a storm. Like a door. A vast pattern of light appeared among the clouds.
For a moment, everyone feared the worst.
Then a figure stepped through. Not Kale. Someone else. Oral.
He descended slowly into the valley. Lyra immediately moved toward him.
What happened?
Oral looked toward the sky.
The final stage has begun. Her expression tightened. Where is Kale? Preparing. For battle?
Oral looked at her.
No. That answer frightened her more. Then what?
Oral looked toward the stone circle.
He is going to meet it. Lyra understood. The first echo. Oral nodded. He has realized something. What? Oral looked at the ancient oak. The first echo has spent eternity asking why existence should continue. A pause. And Kale finally has the answer. Lyra waited.
Oral turned toward the sky.
He is going to show it.
The stars above them changed again. This time, the entire world saw.
Every realm. Every civilization. Every living creature.
The universe itself seemed to pause.
Then a voice entered every mind. Not through sound. Through memory. Why? The question was simple.
But it carried the weight of all existence.
Why continue? People everywhere froze. Some heard the voice as fear. Some heard it as sadness.
Some heard it as their own thoughts.
The first echo was not attacking. It was asking.
And in Asgard, Kale stood before the edge of reality.
Odin beside him. The gods behind him. The realms connected around them. The ancient darkness waited.
Kale closed his eyes. He thought of everything he had lost.
Everything he had gained.
Every person who had changed him.
Then he answered. Not as a prince. Not as a god. Not as a weapon. As a man. Because we can. The darkness remains silent. Kale continued. Because tomorrow exists.
The stars flickered.
Because someone will always need help.
The realms grew brighter.
Because a single kindness can reach someone you will never meet. The darkness trembled. Because even when we know something will end. Kale opened his eyes. We still choose to begin.
For the first time since the beginning of time, the first echo had no response. Because it had known every argument against existence.
Every reason to surrender. Every example of suffering. But it had never understood choice.
And now it was witnessing the one thing that could not be predicted. A universe full of beings who knew they would lose everything someday, and still decided to love.
The darkness began to move. Not toward destruction. Toward Kale. The final moment had arrived. Not a battle. A decision. And every realm waited to discover what the first echo would choose. The darkness approached Kale slowly, not as an invading force, not as a weapon unleashed upon creation, but as something searching. For the first time since anyone had known of its existence, the first echo was not trying to consume. It was trying to understand. Across the 9 realms, everyone watched. In Asgard, warriors stood beside their weapons but did not draw them. On Midgard, millions looked upward as the impossible shape in the heavens moved closer to the golden figure standing at the edge of existence. In the shining valley, Lyra stood beneath the old oak tree with one hand resting against its ancient trunk. She could feel the air changing. Not becoming colder. Not becoming warmer. Becoming quieter. As if the entire universe was listening. Oral stood beside her. "You know," Lyra said softly, "for someone who spent centuries waiting for this moment, you seem strangely calm." Oral looked toward the sky. "I spent centuries believing this moment would be the end. And now?" He watched Kale facing the darkness. "Now I think it might be the beginning." Lyra studied him. "You really are part of him, aren't you?" Oral looked at her. "Yes." "Do you feel what he feels?" A pause. "Yes." "Then you feel everything he carried?" Oral looked down. "Yes." Lyra's expression softened. "That must have been painful." Oral gave a small, humorless smile. "You have no idea." He looked back toward Kale. "For centuries, I carried every doubt he refused to admit." Lyra listened. Every moment he wondered if his sacrifices mattered. Every time he watched someone he cared about disappear. Every time he stood alone and told himself he was fine. Oral's voice became quieter. "I was made from everything he buried." Lyra looked toward the sky. "Then why help him?" Oral answered immediately. "Because he never abandoned me." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "When he finally met me, he could have destroyed me." Oral looked at his hands. "He could have called me a weakness. A mistake. A disease." A faint smile appeared. "But he called me part of himself." The answer remained with Lyra. Because she understood then that Kale's greatest victory was not defeating an enemy. It was refusing to create another one. Above them, the meeting between Kale and the first echo continued. The darkness surrounded him completely. For an instant, the golden light disappeared. The realms gasped. Odin took one step forward. "Kale." But Valora stopped him. "Wait." The Allfather looked at her. "You trust him?" She watched the empty space where Kale had stood. "I trust who he has always been." Inside the darkness, Kale opened his eyes. He was somewhere else. A place without time. Without distance. Without form. The first echo surrounded him. But it was different now. Not a monster. Not a storm. A presence. A question. "You believe they are worth protecting?" Kale answered calmly. "Yes. Even knowing they will suffer." "Yes. Even knowing they will lose everything." "Yes." The darkness shifted. "Why?" Kale looked around. He saw every memory the first echo had collected. Every tragedy. Every ending. Every moment where someone had asked why life had to hurt. Then he saw something else. A child sharing food with another child. A stranger helping someone stand after a fall. A person planting a tree knowing they would never sit beneath its shade. Small acts. Invisible acts. Acts that did not erase suffering. Acts that existed beside it. Because suffering is not the only thing that exists. The darkness remained silent. Kale continued. You looked at every wound in creation. The memories shifted. You counted every loss.
More images appeared.
You measured every ending.
The darkness pulsed.
But you never counted what came between them.
The darkness moved.
What? Kale smiled slightly. The moments people choose each other. A memory appeared. Ilara standing outside the estate on their first winter together. She was angry. Frustrated. Cold.
But she still left a blanket near the door because she noticed he stayed outside repairing equipment late into the night.
A tiny kindness.
A moment she never considered important.
The first echo watched. Kale showed another.
Rowan, years after discovering the truth, quietly repairing a village bridge without accepting payment.
Brenna giving food to travelers. Miriam leaving flowers at a stone circle for decades.
Lyra protecting a secret she barely understood because she believed it mattered.
Millions of moments. None powerful enough to destroy darkness.
But together they created something darkness had never measured.
Meaning. The first echo trembled.
They are temporary.
Kale nodded.
Yes.
They disappear.
Yes.
Asterisk, then why value them? Kale looked directly into the endless darkness. Because they happened. The answer echoed.
They mattered because they existed.
A long silence followed.
Then something unexpected happened.
The first echo asked a different question. Did I matter?
Kale froze.
Not because he did not know the answer.
Because he knew how long that question had waited. The darkness had not wanted to erase existence because it hated life. It wanted to erase existence because it believed it had never belonged within it. Kale stepped forward.
Yes. The darkness shook. I caused suffering. Yes. I frightened them. Yes. I wanted everything to end. Yes. The honesty surprised the darkness. Kale continued.
But you also carried something no one else could. The shadows moved closer.
What? Awareness.
The darkness paused.
You saw every pain. Kale reached toward it. You understood every wound.
His hand touched the shadow.
You knew the universe had suffering.
The golden light spread. But no one showed you that it also had compassion.
For a moment, the first echo became still.
Then the child appeared again. The lonely child from the beginning. This time, he was not afraid.
He looked at Kale. Am I allowed to stay?
The question was almost too quiet to hear.
Kale answered immediately. Yes.
The child looked down.
Even after everything?
Yes.
Why? Kale smiled. Because someone should have told you that a long time ago.
The child stepped forward. And for the first time since creation began, the first echo experienced something it had never known.
Acceptance.
The darkness began changing.
Not disappearing. Transforming.
The endless shadow became streams of silver and gold. The impossible weight carried across existence began flowing back into the universe.
Not as destruction. As understanding. Every realm felt it. A warrior in Asgard suddenly remembered why they fought.
A grieving person on Midgard remembered a loved one with warmth instead of only pain. A dying star somewhere beyond known space released its final light peacefully.
The universe did not become perfect. It became whole.
Then the light faded.
Kale stood alone.
But he was not unchanged. The golden and silver energy around him settled into a quiet glow.
The first echo was gone. Not destroyed. Not imprisoned. Integrated.
Oral appeared beside him. For the first time, they looked completely separate.
The connection between them was gone.
Oral looked at Kale.
So this is what freedom feels like.
Kale smiled.
How does it feel? Oral considered. Quiet. Kale laughed softly.
That sounds strange coming from someone who spent eternity as a voice in another person's mind.
Oral smiled.
I suppose I earned the quiet. The space around them began to shift.
The path back to the realms reopened. Before they returned, Odin appeared. The Allfather looked at his son for a long moment. No armies. No throne. No title. Just a father and son. I owe you an apology.
Kale looked surprised.
Father. No. Odin shook his head. Let me say it.
The king who had commanded gods and shaped the fate of realms lowered his gaze.
I believed protecting you meant deciding what you could bear. A pause.
I forgot that protecting someone also means trusting them. Kale said nothing.
Odin continued.
You deserved the truth.
Yes. The answer was gentle. But honest. Odin accepted it. I know. For a moment, neither moved. Then Kale stepped forward. And they embraced. Not as king and prince. Not as creator and creation. As family. When they separated, Odin looked toward Midgard. What will you do now?
Kale followed his gaze. For the first time in centuries, he had no duty waiting.
No enemy. No burden. No prophecy. Only choice.
And that was something he had not possessed for a very long time. I think, Kale said, I will visit an old valley.
Odin smiled. I thought you might. The Bifrost opened.
This time, Kale walked toward it without being summoned.
Without being sent away. Without sacrifice. He walked because he wanted to.
And far below, beneath the ancient oak tree where a woman had once waited for a husband she did not understand, Lyra looked toward the sky. A golden path appeared among the clouds.
She smiled. He is coming back.
Oral stood beside her.
No. She looked at him. What? Oral watched the descending light. He is not coming back. A pause. He is finally arriving.
The golden light descended over the shining valley without the force of a storm or the grandeur of a divine arrival. There were no thunderous sounds, no armies marching behind it, no announcement from the heavens.
It arrived quietly. Almost humbly.
The same way Kale had lived for 5 years among mortals. The villagers who had gathered near the valley looked upward in disbelief.
Some remembered the old stories.
Some remembered the strange man who had lived among them years earlier. Some had never known him at all. But every person felt the same thing when the light touched the earth. A sense that something ancient had finally found its place. Kale stepped out of the Bifrost.
Not wearing armor. Not carrying a weapon. Not surrounded by divine warriors. Just himself. For a moment, nobody moved.
Then an elderly man near the edge of the crowd dropped his walking stick.
His eyes widened. Impossible. Kale looked at him.
The man approached slowly.
You? Kale recognized him. A village boy from decades ago. Now an old man with silver hair and tired hands.
You helped me repair my father's cart.
The old man stared. You were only pretending to be weak. A small smile appeared on Kale's face. I was never pretending. The man frowned.
But you lifted a broken wagon with one hand.
Kale glanced toward the damaged wooden carts nearby.
Some things require strength. He looked at the villagers.
Other things require patience.
The old man laughed quietly. For the first time in many years, the valley felt lighter.
Not because every problem had disappeared. Not because the world had become perfect. Because the people here understood something important.
The impossible had happened. And yet life continued. Children still ran through fields.
Farmers still worried about weather. Families still argued over ordinary things. The universe had survived.
And ordinary life remained the greatest proof that it had been worth saving.
Lyra waited beneath the old oak tree.
She had changed since the day Kale left.
Not physically. Something far more noticeable.
She no longer carried herself like someone trying to protect a legacy that belonged to the past. She carried herself like someone building a future.
Kale approached. For several seconds, neither spoke.
There had been countless words between them over the years.
Angry words. Painful words. Words left unsaid.
And now, standing beneath the tree where Ilara's story had begun and ended, silence felt different.
Not empty. Complete. Finally, Lyra smiled. You look different.
Kale glanced at himself.
Do I?
Yes.
How? She considered. Before, you looked like someone waiting for something.
Kale looked at the valley.
And now?
Now you look like someone who arrived. The words reminded him of Oral.
He smiled faintly. You spoke with him. Lyra nodded.
He told me many things. I imagine most were unpleasant. He had centuries of bitterness to explain.
Kale looked amused. That sounds like him. Lyra walked closer. Is he gone?
Kale looked toward the horizon.
No.
The answer surprised her.
Then where is he? Kale thought for a moment. Learning. Learning what? How to live.
A quiet breeze moved through the branches above them.
Lyra looked up at the tree. My family kept records about this place for generations. I know. Most of them believed your story was a tragedy.
Kale looked at her. What do you believe?
Lyra touched the bark. I think they were wrong. Why?
Because tragedies end with loss.
She looked back at him.
Your story did not end when you lost everything.
Kale waited.
It changed when you discovered what was left. The words stayed with him. Because that was what he had finally learned.
He had spent centuries measuring his life by what disappeared. The kingdoms that fell. The friends who died. The people he could not save.
But existence was not defined only by what remained. Sometimes it was defined by what had been shared before it was gone.
Days passed. Then weeks.
Then months. And Kale discovered something he had never expected. Peace was harder than war.
A battlefield was simple.
There were enemies. There were goals. There were victories. Peace required something much more difficult.
Living. Choosing. Changing.
He helped rebuild the valley.
Not by commanding.
Not by using divine power.
By working beside everyone else. He carried stone. He repaired roads.
He taught young fighters not only how to win battles but when not to fight. The villagers slowly adjusted to the truth of who he was.
Some struggled. Some were fascinated.
Some simply shrugged.
One farmer summed it up better than anyone. So you are an immortal god who saved existence itself? Kale nodded. Yes. The farmer looked at the fence Kale was repairing. And now you are fixing my fence? Yes. The farmer thought about it. Strange.
Kale smiled.
Very.
The farmer handed him another wooden board.
Well, hold that. And Kale did.
Because after thousands of years, he had learned that being needed for something small could be just as meaningful as being needed for something impossible. Meanwhile, Asgard changed.
The revelation about Kale altered the realm forever.
The old traditions were questioned. The hidden histories were opened.
Records that had been locked away for generations were brought into the light.
Young gods studied not only battles but compassion.
Warriors learned that strength without wisdom was dangerous. And Odin spent more time listening than speaking.
A strange habit for a king who had ruled for ages.
But perhaps the greatest change came from the way Asgard viewed Midgard.
For centuries, many gods had looked down upon mortals.
Temporary. Fragile. Brief. Kale had spent only 5 years among humans.
Yet those 5 years had shaped the fate of existence more than countless centuries of divine power.
The gods finally understood why. Mortals did not have endless time.
That was precisely why their choices mattered. One evening, long after the events that nearly ended creation, Kale sat beneath the oak tree watching the sunset.
Lyra approached carrying 2 cups. She handed one to him. Tea. Kale looked at it. Again? You complained last time. I did not complain.
You said it tasted like something that had been left outside during winter.
Kale smiled. That was accurate. She sat beside him. Then drink it. He did. After a moment, he nodded. Better. You're lying. Yes. She laughed.
It was a small sound.
A normal sound.
The kind of sound Kale once believed he had lost forever.
They sat. Quietly. Not because they had nothing to say. Because they no longer needed to fill every moment with words.
Eventually, Lyra spoke.
Do you ever miss Asgard?
Kale looked at the stars.
Yes. The battles? No. The power? No. What then? He thought about it. The certainty.
Lyra looked at him.
Certainty?
When I was there, I believed everything had a purpose.
And now?
Kale looked around the valley.
At the homes. The fields. The people walking beneath the evening sky. Now I know purpose is something we create.
The answer pleased her. Because it sounded less like a god speaking.
And more like a man. Years continued to pass.
The stories changed.
As they always did. Some people remembered Kale as a warrior.
Some remembered him as a guardian. Some believed he had been a myth.
But the oldest stories always contained one detail. They never spoke about the battles first.
They spoke about the years he spent living as an ordinary man.
Because that was the part nobody expected.
The strongest being in existence was not remembered because he could destroy mountains.
He was remembered because he chose to repair a fence.
Because he chose forgiveness over anger.
Because he chose connection over loneliness. Because when the universe itself asked why anything should continue, the answer did not come from a god.
It came from someone who had lost almost everything and still believed tomorrow was worth reaching. And beneath the old oak tree, where one impossible promise had once begun, the son of Odin finally lived not as a sacrifice, not as a weapon, not as a legend, but as himself. Years passed quietly in the shining valley, but quiet did not mean forgotten. The world had a way of carrying stories forward, reshaping them with every generation. The truth of what happened became mixed with songs, paintings, and legends told beside warm fires.
Some storytellers exaggerated. Some removed details.
Some added impossible victories and imagined battles that had never happened.
But the people who truly knew Kale understood something far more remarkable.
The greatest moment of his life had not been when he stood before the first echo.
It had been every day after. The days when no one was watching. The days when he had no enemy to defeat and no prophecy to fulfill.
The days when he simply chose who he wanted to be. One spring morning, a group of children gathered near the edge of the village where Kale was repairing the roof of an old storage house. They had been watching him for nearly an hour, whispering among themselves. Finally, the smallest child stepped forward.
Is it true? Kale looked down from the roof. Is what true?
The child pointed upward. That you fought a creature older than the stars.
Several other children immediately looked impressed. Kale considered the question. It is true.
The children gasped.
Another child stepped forward. And you defeated it with a magical sword? Kale shook his head. No. With lightning? No. With a giant army? No. The children looked disappointed. The smallest child frowned. Then how did you win? Kale climbed down from the roof and placed his tools aside. He looked toward the valley. Toward the homes. Toward the people working in the fields. Toward the ordinary life that had become more precious than any throne. I listened. The children stared. That's all? Kale smiled. Sometimes that is the hardest thing to do.
The children did not fully understand. They would not for many years.
But they remembered. And sometimes a lesson planted in childhood takes decades to grow.
That afternoon, a messenger from Asgard arrived.
Not through a dramatic opening of the sky. Not with a grand display.
The Bifrost appeared quietly beyond the hills, and a single warrior stepped through.
Kale recognized him immediately. Commander Hymar.
But time had changed him.
The proud warrior who once questioned Kale now walked with the calm of someone who had learned humility. Still repairing things yourself? Kale looked at the wooden beam he was carrying. Still surprised by it? Hymar smiled.
Perhaps. They walked together through the valley.
The commander looked around. When I first met you after your return, I thought you had become too powerful to understand ordinary lives. Kale glanced at him. And now? Hymar watched a farmer greet Kale warmly. Now I think you became powerful because you understood them. They continued walking.
Eventually they reached the oak tree.
Hymar became quiet. I have news. Kale knew from his tone that it was important. What happened? Hymar looked toward the sky. The council has made a decision. Kale waited.
The archives of Asgard will be opened permanently.
Kale looked surprised. All of them? All. Even the sealed records? Even those. A small smile appeared. Odin agreed? Hymar nodded. It was his idea. Kale looked thoughtful. After everything, the man who had once hidden truth had chosen to reveal it. That mattered. He finally understood. Hymar looked at him. What? Kale touched the tree's bark. That protecting people from knowledge is not always protection. The commander nodded. There is more. Kale looked at him. More? Hymar hesitated.
A rare thing for someone like him.
The council wants you to return. Kale was silent. Why? They want you to take your place. Kale understood. The throne. The title. The position that had once belonged to him by birth. He looked across the valley. Children running. Farmers working. Families sharing meals.
A life built not through power, but through presence.
And what place is that? Hymar smiled slightly. You know. Kale looked away.
I spent centuries trying to escape that place.
Because you thought it was a cage. And now? Hymar asked. Is it? Kale did not answer immediately.
Because the truth was complicated. Asgard was not the place that hurt him.
The secrets had hurt him.
The expectations had hurt him. The belief that he existed only for a purpose had hurt him.
But the realm itself? The people? The memories? Those remained. I will visit. Hymar smiled. That is not the answer they want.
It is the answer they need.
The commander laughed. You really are impossible.
Kale looked amused.
I have heard that before.
Before leaving, Hymar stopped.
There is one more thing. Kale waited. The new generation of warriors wants to meet you. Kale raised an eyebrow. Why? Because they grew up hearing stories.
Stories are dangerous.
Why? People expect legends to be perfect. Hymar looked at him. And are you? Kale smiled. No. The commander nodded. Good. Good. Yes. He looked toward the valley. Perfect heroes are impossible to follow. A pause. People can only follow someone who feels real. After Hymar left, Kale remained beneath the oak tree. That evening, Lyra found him there. You are thinking too loudly. Kale looked over. I was sitting quietly. You have a very loud quiet. He smiled. She sat beside him. He asked you to return. Kale nodded. How did you know? Because you have the same expression you had before leaving for Asgard. What expression? The one where you are pretending you already made a decision. Kale laughed softly. You know me too well. No. She looked at the valley. I know Elara's journals. That surprised him. What? She wrote about you. Kale became still. She did? Lyra nodded. Not often. Why? Because she said writing about you was difficult. Kale looked down. What did she write? Lyra smiled faintly. She said you were the most frustrating person she had ever met. Kale laughed. That sounds like her. But she also wrote something else. The smile faded into something warmer. She said you were always trying to carry things alone because you believed your strength was measured by what you could endure. Kale looked at the ground. Lyra continued. She said she hoped one day you would understand that allowing others to stand beside you was also a form of strength. The words reached deeper than any command from Asgard. Because they came from the one person who had understood him before anyone else. Kale looked toward the stars. I spent so much time trying to protect everyone. Lyra waited. And I forgot that people might want to protect me too. The valley grew quiet. Not empty. Peaceful. Later that night, Kale walked alone to the edge of the forest. For the first time in many years, he reached outward with his senses. Not searching for danger. Not preparing for war. Simply listening. He felt Midgard. The countless lives moving beneath the same sky. He felt Asgard. The ancient realm waiting. He felt the other worlds. Still changing. Still growing. Still imperfect. And he smiled. Because imperfection meant there was still room for choices. Still room for kindness. Still room for stories that had not yet been written. But far beyond the 9 realms, beyond the paths known to gods and mortals, something else noticed the change. A place where no light had ever reached. A place untouched by the first echo. A place that had been silent since before creation. Something ancient opened its eyes. Not the first echo. Not the darkness Kale had faced. Something older. Something that had watched the universe begin. And it whispered a name. Kale. The stars flickered. The balance that had finally been restored trembled. And somewhere beyond the edge of everything known, a new chapter began waiting. The whisper did not reach Kale immediately. That was what made it different. Every danger he had faced before had announced itself. Enemies arrived with armies. Monsters roared. Gods declared their intentions. Even the first echo, despite its silence, had carried the unmistakable weight of something approaching. This was different. There was no warning. No disturbance. No crack in reality. Just a name spoken in a place where no voice should have existed. And yet, somewhere beyond the borders of the known realms, something had noticed him. Weeks passed before anyone understood that something had changed. At first, the signs were small. A group of astronomers in Midgard discovered that certain stars had shifted positions by impossible distances overnight. A ship crossing the northern oceans reported seeing a second moon reflected in the water, even though the sky showed only one.
A village deep within a forgotten mountain range woke to find every shadow pointing in the wrong direction.
Individually, the events seemed unrelated.
Together, they formed a pattern. And patterns were what the old keepers had always feared most. Lyra discovered the first connection. She had spent months studying the newly opened archives of Asgard, searching through records that had remained hidden for thousands of years. She had expected stories of battles, forgotten kingdoms, and ancient rulers. Instead, she found something far more disturbing.
Silences. Missing pages. References to events that had been intentionally removed.
One evening, while reading beneath the oak tree, she found a symbol carved into the edge of an old manuscript. It was not the mark of Odin. It was not the symbol of the first echo. She had never seen it before. Yet something about it felt familiar. She carried the manuscript to Kale. He was standing near the river, helping villagers rebuild a damaged bridge after heavy rainfall.
Not commanding. Not supervising. Working.
When he saw her expression, he immediately stopped.
What happened? Lyra held up the manuscript. I found something.
Kale looked at the symbol. For several seconds, he said nothing. That alone worried her.
What is it?
Kale touched the mark carefully.
I don't know.
Lyra looked surprised.
You don't know?
He shook his head.
That concerns me.
The two words carried more weight than panic. Kale had lived through impossible events. His lack of knowledge was rare.
What do the records say? Lyra opened the manuscript. Almost nothing. Almost? She nodded. That is the problem.
She turned the pages.
Every reference to the symbol is followed by the same phrase. Kale read the ancient writing. What phrase?
Lyra looked at him. Before the first light. The river continued flowing beside them. Birds moved through the trees. The world looked completely normal. But Kale felt something he had not felt since the first echo.
Not fear. Recognition.
Where did you find this?
In the oldest section of the Asgard archives.
Older than the first echo records?
Yes.
Kale stared at the manuscript.
That should not exist. Lyra frowned. Why?
Because the first echo records described the beginning of creation.
And this is older?
Kale looked toward the horizon.
According to this. He paused. It is. That night, Kale returned to Asgard. Not summoned. Not commanded. Chosen. The difference mattered.
Odin met him at the Bifrost. The old king had expected him.
You found it.
Kale stopped.
You knew. Odin looked away. I suspected. That is not the same. No. Odin sighed.
I learned of these records after you defeated the first echo.
Kale's expression hardened. Why was I not told? Because I hoped they were wrong.
The answer was painfully honest.
Kale entered the palace with Odin beside him. The symbol existed before the first echo? Odin nodded.
Before the realms were divided.
Before Asgard? Yes. Before the gods? A pause. Yes. The answer changed everything. The first echo had been the oldest threat everyone knew. But perhaps it was only the oldest threat anyone remembered. They entered the Hall of Wisdom.
A single object waited on the central table.
A stone tablet. Black. Smooth. Completely untouched by time. Kale approached it.
The moment he touched it, the room changed.
The walls disappeared.
The floor vanished. For a brief moment, Kale stood in a place beyond the realms. A place before stars. Before worlds.
Before names.
There were no creatures there.
No voices. No movement. Only endless possibility. Then something appeared. Not a body. Not a shape. A presence. And it spoke. The guardian has awakened. Kale pulled his hand away. The vision ended. He stood in the Hall of Wisdom again. Everyone was watching him. Odin stepped forward. What did you see? Kale looked at the tablet. Something that knows me. The room became tense. An enemy? Kale considered. No. The answer surprised everyone. Then what? Kale looked at the symbol. A witness.
Lyra, who had followed him to Asgard, stepped closer.
A witness to what?
Kale looked toward the distant stars beyond the palace windows.
To the beginning. Odin's expression darkened. Then it has waited a very long time. Kale nodded.
And now it knows I exist. Before anyone could respond, the palace shook.
Not violently. Not like an attack. Like something enormous had moved somewhere far away.
Every light in Asgard dimmed. The warriors outside stopped. The Bifrost flickered. And then every person in the 9 realms heard the same sound.
A heartbeat. 1, 2, 3. Then silence. A messenger rushed into the hall. All-Father. Odin turned. What happened?
The messenger struggled to speak.
The borders between realms.
He looked terrified.
They are disappearing. No one moved. Kale understood immediately. The first echo had threatened existence because it wanted everything to become silent.
But this new force was different. It was not destroying the boundaries between worlds.
It was removing them. Asgard. Midgard. The other realms.
All of them were beginning to overlap.
Different realities. Different histories. Different possibilities. Colliding. Lyra looked at Kale. What does it want?
Kale stared at the changing sky. For the first time since becoming whole, he felt the burden of uncertainty return.
I don't know.
Then he looked at the tablet. But I think I know why it came.
Odin waited.
Kale spoke quietly.
The first echo was the wound. A pause. This is something else.
The stars outside shifted again.
The thing that created the wound.
The hall fell silent.
Because everyone understood the meaning.
They had spent ages fighting the consequence. Him stood radiant gods watching countless destinies unfold. One raven landed upon the throne's arm and whispered without words.
Odin's expression grew thoughtful.
5 years have nearly passed, he said quietly.
My son has honored every condition. Another deity asked, will he return willingly?
Odin looked toward the mortal world where Aldrin stacked firewood while neighbors mocked him for working too slowly. He always keeps his promises, the All-Father replied, but the world below has one final lesson to teach before he comes home. Far beneath those unseen heavens, Lord Cassion's spies finally uncovered a fragment of forgotten history linking the Halvar bloodline to an impossible warrior who had once descended from the sky, and as the commander carried that discovery through a moonlit forest toward his master, a hooded figure stepped silently onto the narrow path ahead, forcing the horses to rear in terror, and the commander slowly reached for his sword as gray eyes emerged beneath the traveler's hood, calm, ancient, and completely without fear. The commander had faced assassins, mercenaries, and wild beasts, yet none of those memories prepared him for the sensation that settled over the forest when the hooded traveler lifted his gaze. The wind stopped as though reluctant to interrupt whatever would happen next.
Even the frightened horses ceased their desperate movements and stood trembling with lowered heads. Move aside, the commander ordered, attempting to fill his voice with authority. I carry business for Lord Cassion. The traveler answered with surprising politeness. I know exactly where you are going.
The commander's fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword. Then you know standing in my path is unwise. A faint smile crossed the stranger's lips.
No. I know carrying those papers is.
Steel flashed as the commander lunged forward with the speed of a veteran soldier. His blade sliced through the air with practiced precision, aimed directly for the traveler's throat. Instead of dodging, the hooded man leaned a fraction of an inch. The sword missed so narrowly that it shaved a loose strand of hair before striking empty space. The commander spun immediately into a second attack, then a third, each one faster than the last, but every strike encountered only air. There was no dramatic display, no impossible leap, only small effortless movements that made a lifetime of training appear clumsy. Frustration replaced confidence.
"Who are you?" the commander demanded.
Someone who promised an old friend his family would live in peace.
Before another attack could begin, the traveler tapped 2 fingers lightly against the man's chest.
The commander felt no pain, only a violent wave of exhaustion. His knees buckled. Darkness swallowed his vision before he struck the ground. The horses settled calmly. The hooded figure removed a leather satchel from the unconscious commander's shoulder, opened it, and withdrew several sealed documents.
Moonlight reflected from wax imprinted with Lord Cashin's crest. Aldrin read every page in silence.
They contained names of bribed officials, planned military movements, forged financial records, and, most importantly, a report describing rumors surrounding the mysterious protector of House Halvar. The spies had gathered fragments of truth but reached the wrong conclusion. They believed the Guardian belonged to an ancient order of hidden knights rather than a single immortal being. Aldrin folded the papers neatly, replacing all but one. The missing document dissolved into glowing dust between his fingers. When the commander awoke hours later, he remembered being ambushed by ordinary thieves.
He never questioned why the memory felt incomplete.
By the following afternoon, Lord Cashin received his surviving reports. He read them twice before narrowing his eyes. "Interesting," he murmured. "Not because of what remains, but because something is missing." His advisor frowned.
"You can tell?"
Cashin smiled without warmth.
"Anyone hiding evidence always reveals which evidence matters most."
Instead of abandoning his plans, he became more careful.
Double the surveillance around the Halvar estate. Do not search for invisible warriors. Watch the ordinary people. Great secrets usually hide beneath dull lives.
While spies quietly spread through villages surrounding the estate, life inside the Halvar household followed familiar rhythms. Ilara spent long hours negotiating grain prices after a poor harvest threatened hundreds of tenant families. She rode from village to village despite freezing rain, listening patiently to worried farmers, calculating costs by candlelight, and refusing profitable arrangements that would leave poorer families hungry during winter. She returned home exhausted each evening only to discover meals waiting, firewood already stacked beside the hearth, and her horse brushed clean before entering the stable.
She assumed the servants handled everything until one afternoon Brenna chuckled softly while kneading bread. "You thanked everyone except the one doing most of it." Ilara looked up. "What do you mean?" "Your husband wakes before sunrise every day." Brenna wiped flour from her hands. "He chops wood while everyone sleeps. Repairs fences before breakfast. Delivers food to widows who would never accept charity if it came from the estate. Then he disappears to work elsewhere so no one accuses him of living off your family." Ilara blinked in disbelief. "Why hasn't anyone mentioned this?" "Because no one asks." The words lingered in Ilara's thoughts long after she left the kitchen. That evening she found Aldrin mending a broken wagon wheel beneath fading sunlight. His hands moved with patient confidence. The work was neither hurried nor careless. "You've been fixing these all week?" she asked unexpectedly. He nodded without looking up. "The northern road damaged several carts." "For payment?" "Most couldn't afford it." "Then why?" He examined the finished wheel before answering. "If they lose their wagons, they lose their harvest. If they lose the harvest, children go hungry." The wheel seemed easier to repair than hunger. She stared at him, unsure how to respond. Every conversation they had shared during 5 years suddenly seemed incomplete, as though she had spent all that time speaking to only a small corner of the man before her. She wanted to ask why he never defended himself against insults or demanded recognition for quiet acts of kindness, yet the words refused to come. Instead she asked, "Would you like some tea?" Aldrin looked genuinely surprised. "I'd enjoy that."
They sat together outside as evening painted the mountains in shades of amber and violet.
For the first time since their marriage, silence between them felt peaceful rather than awkward. Ilara noticed tiny details she had overlooked for years. He never interrupted. He listened fully before answering.
He observed birds circling overhead with the same attention he gave complicated conversations. When a frightened stray dog approached cautiously, Aldrin held out part of his bread without making sudden movements. The animal accepted the food before curling beside his feet as though greeting an old friend.
"Animals trust you quickly," Ilara remarked. "Most creatures can tell when they aren't being judged." "Can people?" He smiled. "Sometimes. We just complicate it."
Their quiet moment ended when distant church bells rang frantically from the direction of Verald. Thick smoke rose beyond the hills. A messenger arrived moments later, breathless from writing without pause. "The Western Market is burning. Several warehouses collapsed. Half the city is trying to contain the fire."
Ilara stood immediately. "Prepare wagons. Gather blankets and medical supplies." Before anyone noticed, Aldrin slipped away.
By the time the Halvar convoy reached the city, chaos consumed every street.
Flames leaped between rooftops while panicked families formed desperate bucket lines stretching toward the river. Timber cracked. Horses screamed. Children cried out for missing parents. Ilara threw herself into the rescue effort without
hesitation, organizing volunteers and directing supplies wherever injuries were greatest. She searched repeatedly for Aldrin but assumed he had remained behind at the estate. Hidden beyond walls of smoke, however, the immortal moved through collapsing buildings unseen. Massive support beams that should have crushed trapped civilians suddenly stopped falling inches above terrified heads.
Entire sections of burning roofs shifted just enough for families to escape.
A little girl stranded on the third floor of a blazing bakery later insisted a tall man wrapped in light carried her safely outside before disappearing.
Adults dismissed her story as shock. Yet dozens survived disasters that should have claimed their lives.
Near midnight the fire reached the city's powder stores. If the flames touched the barrels, half of Verald would vanish beneath an explosion. Firefighters struggled desperately but could not approach through the intense heat.
Hidden behind dense smoke, Aldrin finally allowed a fragment of his true strength to surface.
He planted one hand against the stone foundation and whispered words older than mortal kingdoms.
Frost spread outward across the ground with astonishing speed. Flames recoiled.
Steam erupted into the night sky as impossible cold swallowed the burning warehouse. Within seconds the fire died completely. Witnesses standing far away saw only a brilliant flash shining through smoke before vanishing.
Rumors began before dawn. Some claimed an angel intervened.
Others insisted the old mountain spirits had awakened. Lord Cashin listened carefully to every version. "Miracles are becoming far too common around House Halvar," he observed.
"Increase the reward for information."
Weeks later the kingdom celebrated the annual Festival of Lanterns, a tradition honoring ancestors by releasing thousands of floating lights across the great river.
Music echoed through crowded streets while merchants displayed colorful fabrics, polished jewelry, and sweet pastries dusted with cinnamon.
Children laughed as performers juggled burning torches. Even Lady Miriam seemed unusually cheerful after profitable trade agreements restored part of the family's fortune.
Ilara persuaded Aldrin to attend despite his reluctance.
"If nothing else," she insisted, "people might stop saying you never leave the estate."
He chuckled. "That may be too ambitious."
They wandered through crowded avenues beneath hundreds of glowing lanterns. At first they spoke little, but gradually conversation came more naturally.
Ilara pointed toward musicians she remembered from childhood.
Aldrin shared amusing stories about places he had supposedly visited during years of wandering. Most were true, though separated by centuries rather than decades. As darkness deepened, fireworks erupted above the river. Brilliant colors reflected across the water while thousands gathered along stone bridges to watch.
Ilara stood quietly beside him. "Do you ever regret marrying me?" she asked suddenly. Aldrin answered without hesitation. No. Even after everything? Especially after everything.
She looked at him in confusion.
I've never been kind to you.
You carried responsibilities no one should have faced alone.
That's not an answer.
He turned toward the river before speaking softly.
Sometimes people mistake exhaustion for cruelty. I never did.
Emotion tightened her throat. Before she could reply, an explosion unlike the fireworks shattered the celebration.
One of the ancient bridge towers erupted outward in a shower of stone. Screams replaced music instantly. Masked attackers poured through the smoke wielding curved blades and crossbows.
Their leader shouted, "Take Lady Ylara alive!" Panic swept through the festival.
Families scattered in every direction.
Guards rushed to intercept the attackers but found themselves overwhelmed by disciplined fighters who had clearly planned every movement.
Lord Cashin had finally abandoned subtlety.
Hidden among the assassins were mercenaries from distant kingdoms who cared nothing for politics, only payment.
Ylara
instinctively reached for a fallen guard's sword despite limited training.
Aldrin stepped between her and the charging attackers. Stay behind me. There are too many. Not tonight.
The first assassin swung a heavy axe.
Aldrin caught the weapon's wooden handle with one hand. It splintered instantly.
Another fired a crossbow at point-blank range. The bolt changed direction mid-flight, embedding harmlessly into a nearby wagon.
3 more attackers rushed together.
Aldrin moved so quickly that none of the surrounding civilians understood what happened. The mercenaries collapsed unconscious before their weapons touched the ground.
Ylara stared in stunned silence. Aldrin. More enemies surrounded them from every side. The immortal realized restraint would no longer protect her.
His 5-year vow would end before the next sunrise. The promise had nearly been fulfilled. Looking into Yllara's frightened eyes, he spoke with a calm she had never heard before.
Whatever happens after tonight, remember one thing.
What? She whispered.
None of this was ever your fault alone.
Then he stepped forward into the center of the bridge as dozens of armed killers charged together, and for the first time in 5 years the quiet husband everyone had mocked stopped pretending to be ordinary. A hush unlike any silence known to mortals spread across the shattered bridge. It did not erase the screams echoing from nearby streets or the crackling of overturned market stalls burning along the riverbank. Instead, it seemed to separate Aldrin from the ordinary flow of time itself. Every heartbeat around him became distinct. Every raindrop left from the evening mist appeared suspended in the air like tiny crystals reflecting the glow of floating lanterns. The assassins charged with absolute confidence, believing they outnumbered one exhausted laborer by more than 30 to 1. They had been hired because they were among the finest killers in 3 kingdoms. They had hunted nobles, generals, and entire military escorts without leaving witnesses.
None of them had ever encountered a son of Odin.
The first mercenary thrust his spear toward Aldrin's chest. Before the iron tip reached its target, Aldrin caught the shaft with 2 fingers. The wood exploded into splinters that flew harmlessly past terrified spectators. Without striking the man himself, Aldrin simply pushed the broken weapon aside. The force carried its owner several yards through the air before he landed unconscious against a stone fountain. A pair of swordsmen attacked from opposite directions with flawless coordination. Aldrin stepped between them so smoothly that their blades collided with each other instead of flesh. The impact shattered both swords. Before either fighter recovered, he tapped each lightly on the shoulder. The 2 men collapsed as though sleep had overtaken them in the middle of battle. A crossbow volley darkened the sky. Hundreds of steel bolts descended toward civilians trapped on the bridge. Ylara watched in horror, certain there was no possible escape. Aldrin raised one hand. Thunder rolled overhead despite clear skies beyond the city. Every bolt stopped in midair. Gasps swept through the crowd. For one impossible second the arrows hovered above the bridge like frozen stars before turning to fine silver dust that drifted harmlessly into the river below. Panic spread among the attackers. "He's using sorcery," one shouted. "No," another whispered after seeing Aldrin's eyes briefly blaze with golden light. That's no sorcerer. Their leader, a scarred veteran named Rovan, refused to retreat.
Kill him, he roared. Whatever he is, he can bleed.
10 elite warriors rushed together, abandoning individual attacks in favor of overwhelming force. Aldrin finally moved with the speed he had hidden for 5 long years. To the watching crowd he vanished.
A violent gust of wind swept across the bridge.
One after another, the mercenaries found their weapons torn from their hands before invisible blows struck their armor with astonishing precision.
None suffered mortal wounds.
Every one of them simply collapsed unconscious where they stood.
Within seconds only Rovan remained standing.
Sweat poured down the commander's face as he stared at the quiet man who had defeated his entire company without drawing a weapon. "Who are you?" he asked, his confidence completely gone.
Aldrin looked at him with neither anger nor pride. "A promise kept."
Rovan screamed and charged anyway, lifting a massive war hammer above his head. The weapon never completed its swing.
Aldrin placed his palm against the hammer's iron head. A deep metallic groan echoed through the bridge.
Cracks raced across the enchanted steel until the enormous weapon crumbled into rust that slipped through Rovan's trembling fingers. The commander dropped to his knees.
"Please,"
he whispered.
"I was only following orders." "Then follow a better one," Aldrin replied. "Go home.
Tell those who hired you that House Halvar stands under my protection until dawn."
Rovan staggered backward before turning and fleeing into the darkness without looking back once.
The remaining assassins who still possessed enough strength to stand abandoned the battle immediately. Throughout the bridge, stunned silence replaced chaos. Guards who had arrived expecting a desperate fight instead found dozens of defeated mercenaries scattered across the stone roadway while one unarmed man stood calmly among them.
Ilara could not move.
The person before her wore the same simple clothes she had washed countless times, the same worn boots she had quietly considered embarrassing, yet everything else had changed. His posture no longer suggested weariness. He stood effortlessly upright, as though mountains themselves rested lightly upon his shoulders. Even the air around him carried a quiet authority impossible to ignore. "Aldrin," she said again, almost afraid of the name. He turned toward her, and for an instant the golden light faded completely, revealing the gentle gray eyes she had always known. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The question struck her harder than everything she had just witnessed. He had dismantled an army with impossible strength, yet his first concern remained whether she had been injured. She shook her head slowly. Who are you?" Before he could answer, the night sky split open. It began as a single line of brilliant white stretching from horizon to horizon. Then the heavens themselves seemed to unfold. Clouds spiraled apart. Countless stars vanished behind rivers of living gold cascading downward from unimaginable heights. Every person in Verald looked upward. Bells rang throughout the city although no human hands touched them. Dogs lowered themselves to the ground. Horses bowed their heads instinctively. Birds sleeping beneath rooftops burst into flight all at once, circling beneath the impossible light. Far above the mortal world, a horn sounded. Its note rolled across the sky like the voice of creation itself. Aldrin closed his eyes. "Right on time," he murmured. Ilara stared upward in speechless awe as a bridge of shimmering light slowly descended from the heavens. It stretched farther than vision could follow, connecting the earth to a realm hidden beyond mortal understanding. Figures appeared upon it one by one. They were taller than ordinary men, clothed in armor that reflected entire constellations, carrying spears whose tips shone brighter than the moon. They marched in perfect silence until the foremost warrior stopped several paces before Aldrin. He struck the base of his spear against the stone bridge. The sound echoed through the city like distant thunder. Then he knelt. Every other radiant warrior immediately followed. Hundreds of divine soldiers bowed before the man everyone had mocked as a useless husband. The captain spoke in a voice both powerful and respectful. "Prince Kael, son of Odin, your vow has been fulfilled. The debt to Lord Edric's bloodline has been repaid in full. The All-Father summons you home." A wave of disbelief swept across the gathered crowd. Some dropped to their knees.
Others simply stared with mouths open, unable to reconcile years of ridicule with the impossible truth unfolding before them.
Lady Miriam arrived breathless with Rowan close behind. Both froze at the edge of the bridge.
Rowan laughed nervously at first, convinced it had to be an elaborate illusion. This isn't funny. No one answered him.
Brenna quietly wiped tears from her eyes. She had suspected there was something extraordinary about Aldrin, but nothing approaching this. Ilara remained rooted where she stood.
Every memory from the past 5 years flooded back with painful clarity. Every insult spoken across dinner tables. Every disappointed glance. Every cold reply.
Every time she had watched him endure humiliation without defending himself. She remembered him carrying grain in the rain while she wondered why he lacked ambition. She remembered accusing him of disappearing without purpose, unaware he had been risking himself against monsters she could never imagine. She remembered asking whether he regretted marrying her.
Especially after everything. Now she finally understood his answer. It had never been pity. It had been compassion. Her breathing became uneven.
"No," she whispered.
"No." Aldrin looked at her gently. "The promise is over."
She stepped toward him.
You knew all along." "Yes. You let us believe. It was necessary."
Tears filled her eyes.
"Why didn't you tell me?"
"Because then the vow would have failed."
5 years.
She said, her voice breaking completely.
5 years I treated you like.
She could not finish the sentence.
Aldrin walked closer until only a few feet separated them. You treated me as someone you believed I was. I never blamed you for that. I blamed you for everything. I know. I thought you were weak. Yes.
I was ashamed to call you my husband. Those words seemed to hurt her more than anyone else.
Aldrin remained silent for several moments before answering softly.
And yet, even when you believed those things, you still chose to help your people instead of yourself. You carried your family's burdens without complaint.
You were never the cruel woman you think you became.
She shook her head desperately.
You don't understand. Then help me understand.
She looked directly into his eyes for perhaps the first time since the day they met.
Somewhere along the way.
Her voice trembled uncontrollably. I stopped seeing a burden and started seeing the kindest man I'd ever known.
The confession hung between them as the heavenly light continued pouring across the bridge.
I just realized it too late. Around them, not a single divine warrior interrupted. Even the captain lowered his gaze respectfully.
Aldrin smiled with genuine warmth.
Better late than never.
Hope flickered briefly across Ilara's face.
Then stay.
The smile faded, not from lack of feeling but from quiet sadness. I can't. Why?
Because promises bind gods as surely as chains bind men. She reached for his hand.
There has to be another way.
Before he could answer, the radiant captain rose. Prince Kael, he said solemnly, the gates of Asgard remain open only for a short time.
The All-Father awaits. Aldrin nodded once. He turned back toward Ilara. There is something I never told you. Then tell me now.
The day we married, I expected to leave after 5 years with no memories worth keeping. He looked around the estate's gathered servants, the frightened townspeople, Brenna's tearful smile, and finally back to Ilara.
I was wrong.
A tear slipped down her cheek.
Then don't leave.
He gently placed one hand against hers. Warmth unlike anything she had ever felt spread through her fingers. If I stay, the realms I was born to protect lose one of their guardians. If I leave, your world keeps the peace I fought to preserve. She closed her eyes.
She understood.
She hated that she understood.
Above them, the bridge of light shimmered more brightly as though time itself urged the immortal prince toward home.
Ilara refused to release his hand even as the radiance pouring from the heavens grew brighter with every passing heartbeat. Around them the city remained frozen in reverent silence. Fires still smoldered in overturned carts, frightened horses still stamped nervously against the cobblestones, and the river continued carrying hundreds of lanterns toward the distant sea, yet no one seemed willing to breathe too loudly, afraid that the slightest sound might shatter the final moments shared between the immortal and the woman who had only just discovered the truth hidden inside 5 ordinary years. Aldrin studied her face carefully, noticing details he had quietly memorized long ago without ever admitting it to himself. He noticed the faint scar near her eyebrow from falling out of an apple tree as a child, the tiny wrinkle that appeared whenever she worried about someone else before herself, and the determination that had carried her family through years when everything around them had seemed destined to collapse. For the first time since accepting Odin's command, he wondered what his life might have become had he been born a mortal instead of a son of the All-Father. The thought arrived unexpectedly, lingered for a single heartbeat, and quietly disappeared. Some roads could be imagined but never walked. Ilara finally found enough strength to speak. When you looked at me every morning, what did you see? Aldrin answered without searching for words. Someone trying very hard not to fail the people she loved. She lowered her eyes. I barely looked at you. You looked, he replied gently. Just not with understanding. And yet you still protected me. That was my promise. Was it only a promise? The question remained suspended between them. Aldrin did not answer immediately because for perhaps the first time in centuries, he was uncertain which truth would be kinder. Before he could decide, another voice echoed across the bridge. Perhaps that answer belongs to him alone. Every head turned toward the descending bridge of light. A single figure unlike the others approached from the radiant path. He wore no helmet and carried no weapon. His silver hair reached his shoulders, and his cloak shimmered like moonlight upon fresh snow. His face possessed the ageless calm of someone who had witnessed civilizations rise and vanish like passing seasons. Even the divine warriors bowed their heads more deeply as he approached. Lord Hymar, the captain said respectfully. The newcomer inclined his head before stopping beside Aldrin. The All-Father grants you a few more moments. His gaze shifted toward Ilara with quiet curiosity rather than judgment. Mortals often surprise the halls of Asgard. Ilara instinctively bowed, but Hymar lifted one hand. Do not kneel because others do. Stand as yourself. She straightened slowly, still unable to understand why beings from legend spoke to her with such unexpected respect. Hymar smiled faintly. You are wondering why the heavens waited patiently while the two of you spoke. She nodded. Because every warrior who serves Odin understands sacrifice. Few understand choosing sacrifice without receiving gratitude. His eyes rested upon Aldrin. Your husband did. Those simple words carried more weight than any praise shouted before crowds. Ilara looked toward Aldrin again. Husband. The words sounded entirely different now. No embarrassment. No resignation. Only regret that she had waited until the final night to speak it with warmth. Before either of them could continue, a deep vibration rolled beneath the city. Stone trembled. Lanterns swayed violently. Cracks raced across portions of the bridge already damaged by the earlier attack. The divine captain turned sharply toward the eastern horizon. Impossible. Hymar's expression hardened. The gate has been followed. Far beyond the city walls, the night split open once more, but this time no golden light emerged. Instead a wound of absolute darkness tore across the mountainside. Thick black mist poured from the opening, swallowing trees as though they had never existed. Within moments towering figures began emerging from the rift. They were giants, their bodies forged from black stone veined with glowing crimson fissures. Each footstep shook the valley. Behind them came winged creatures wrapped in smoke, followed by armored beasts with glowing blue eyes and tusks longer than swords. Citizens screamed and fled as church bells rang wildly across the city. The divine captain immediately raised his spear. Form ranks. Hundreds of radiant warriors moved with perfect precision, creating a shining wall between the advancing darkness and the city below. Hymar looked toward Aldrin. The enemies of Asgard have found the passage while it remains open. Aldrin's expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened. How many?
Hymar watched the growing army emerging from the rift.
Enough to test whether Midgard still deserves divine protection. Ilara stared at the impossible army in horror.
They came because of the bridge. Hymar nodded once. They sensed it opening. Aldrin released a slow breath.
Then they must not pass.
He turned toward Ilara. Stay with Brenna. Do not leave the square no matter what happens. She grabbed his arm. You're leaving already? Not yet. He looked toward the approaching darkness. First I finish one last duty.
Before she could protest, the ground erupted as one of the stone giants leaped from the mountainside, crashing into the outer district with enough force to flatten several abandoned warehouses. Soldiers rushed forward only to watch their arrows snap harmlessly against the creature's rocky hide. The giant roared, its voice carrying across the city like an avalanche. Aldrin walked forward alone. Every divine warrior instinctively stepped aside to clear his path.
The giant noticed him and laughed, a sound like boulders grinding together.
It swung an arm the size of an ancient oak tree.
Aldrin did not evade.
He caught the descending fist with one hand. The impact sent a shockwave racing through nearby buildings, shattering windows across the district.
For one long second neither moved. Then cracks spread across the giant's arm. The creature's laughter turned into confusion. Aldrin pushed upward.
The enormous body rose completely off the ground before crashing backward through 3 stone towers, disappearing beneath an explosion of dust. Cheers erupted from frightened citizens, but the celebration lasted only moments as dozens more giants continued advancing.
Aldrin glanced toward the divine captain. Protect the people. And you, the captain asked.
A familiar, quiet smile appeared. I'll make them regret crossing the bridge. Golden light erupted around him, no longer hidden beneath mortal restraint.
Armor unlike anything forged by human hands materialized piece by piece across his body.
Silver plates etched with living runes covered his chest and shoulders. A crimson cloak unfurled behind him despite the absence of wind. Finally a long spear appeared in his grasp, its shaft carved from white wood that seemed older than the stars themselves.
Every mortal watching instinctively stepped backward.
This was not the humble laborer they had known. This was the immortal prince spoken of only in forgotten legends. Ilara felt both awe and sorrow. She realized that even now she had not truly seen the whole of him.
Aldrin raised the spear toward the dark horizon. Lightning answered.
Not from clouds, but from the weapon itself. The first bolt struck the advancing army, scattering monstrous creatures in every direction. The second split the earth beneath another giant, swallowing it into a glowing chasm. Then Aldrin charged. He crossed the distance so quickly that most witnesses lost sight of him entirely.
Explosions of light erupted among the enemy ranks. Giants toppled one after another.
Winged beasts fell from the sky trailing blue fire.
Divine warriors joined the battle, meeting the invaders in brilliant clashes that illuminated the night brighter than daylight.
Ilara could do nothing except watch. For years she had believed courage meant enduring hardship. Now she witnessed another kind altogether, the willingness to stand alone before overwhelming darkness simply because no one else could. The battle spread across the valley. Rivers of light and shadow collided between shattered hills. Hymar directed the heavenly host with calm precision while Aldrin drove deeper into enemy lines, always moving toward the source of the rift. Hidden beyond the towering monsters stood a solitary figure wrapped in black armor. Unlike the others, this warrior remained perfectly still, observing the battlefield with patient confidence. As Aldrin approached, the armored stranger slowly removed his helmet. His face resembled a weathered king's, though one scar of glowing obsidian stretched from forehead to chin. Kale, the stranger called, his voice carrying effortlessly across the chaos.
Aldrin stopped.
Recognition flickered across his face.
Vargon. The dark warrior smiled. It has been centuries. Not long enough?
Vargon spread his arms toward the battlefield. You always did choose impossible causes. And you always chose the wrong side.
The wrong side? Vargon laughed. Look at them.
He gestured toward the fleeing citizens. 5 years they mocked you. 5 years they spat upon the son of Odin without knowing whose table they shared. They deserved abandonment, not protection.
Aldrin's
expression remained unchanged.
Their ignorance was never their greatest flaw. Then what was? Believing they understood someone after seeing only the surface. Vargan's smile faded. You still defend them?
Yes.
Even her?
His eyes shifted briefly toward Ilara standing far away on the bridge.
Especially her.
Vargan sighed as though disappointed by an old friend who refused to change. Then nothing remains except the oldest conversation in existence.
Black fire erupted around him.
A colossal sword formed within his grasp, its blade drinking in every trace of surrounding light. Aldrin lowered his spear into a ready stance. Across the valley, every divine warrior and every creature of darkness instinctively retreated, creating a vast circle of empty ground.
They all understood what was about to happen.
Two immortals who had once fought side by side before history began would now decide the fate of the gateway between worlds, and every soul watching, mortal and divine alike, could feel that when their weapons finally met, nothing in the valley would remain unchanged. The young woman stared at the stranger for several seconds without answering. Most travelers who visited the valley asked about local legends, hiking trails, or directions back to the town center.
None began a conversation by asking what year it was. Her first instinct was to dismiss him as eccentric, but something in his expression prevented her.
He did not appear confused. He seemed genuinely interested, as though confirming an important detail before taking another step.
It's 2148, she replied cautiously. You really didn't know? The traveler nodded once.
I had a rough estimate. His answer sounded so matter-of-fact that she almost laughed despite herself. Instead, she studied him more carefully. He looked to be in his early 30s. His clothes were clean but remarkably plain compared with modern fashion, and although his boots appeared old-fashioned, they showed almost no signs of wear.
Most striking of all were his eyes.
They held an unusual stillness, not empty or distant, but attentive in a way that made her feel he noticed every movement of the wind through the grass and every bird calling from the nearby trees.
You're not from around here, she said. Not anymore. Where are you from? He looked toward the stone circle before answering. A very old promise. She frowned.
That's not a place.
No.
A faint smile crossed his face.
It isn't.
Before she could press further, voices echoed from the path leading up the hill. A group of tourists climbed toward the memorial accompanied by a local guide wearing a bright blue jacket embroidered with the seal of the Verald Historical Institute. The guide stopped near the circle and addressed the visitors with practiced enthusiasm.
Welcome to the Shining Valley Memorial.
According to legend, this was the site where the mythical son of Odin defeated an army from another realm nearly 800 years ago. Modern archaeology confirms the stone formation is unlike any natural geological process, though no scientific explanation has yet accounted for its unusual structure. A boy in the group raised his hand.
Do people still believe the story?
The guide chuckled politely.
Some do.
History and mythology often become intertwined over long periods. We know there was likely a significant battle here centuries ago, but whether a god walked among the people. He shrugged with a friendly smile.
That depends on who you ask. Kale listened quietly from a distance.
The young woman watched him instead of the guide.
She expected annoyance or disappointment.
Instead, he seemed almost amused. You're smiling, she observed. The story survived.
Most people think it's only a legend. Legends often last longer than certainty.
The guide continued speaking. One unusual tradition has remained unchanged for centuries. Every year, people leave simple gifts instead of expensive offerings. Bread, flowers, repaired tools, handwritten letters. The custom comes from the belief that the mysterious guardian valued ordinary kindness more than grand monuments. Several visitors stepped forward, placing small items near the edge of the stone circle.
An elderly mechanic carefully laid down a polished wrench.
A little girl placed half of a homemade sandwich on a folded napkin. A university student left a notebook containing pages of volunteer schedules for community shelters.
The young woman noticed the traveler's expression soften.
They remembered, he whispered so quietly she almost failed to hear him. Before she could ask what he meant, a sharp crack echoed across the valley. Every bird resting in the old oak tree erupted into flight simultaneously.
The tourists looked around in confusion.
The guide frowned toward the northern ridge. Another crack followed, deeper this time, accompanied by a strange vibration beneath the ground. The young woman immediately reached inside her coat and pulled out a compact scanner resembling a metallic compass. Its circular display flickered wildly with crimson symbols.
"No," she muttered. Kale noticed the device. "What is that?"
She hesitated. "Something I hoped I'd never have to use."
"It detects the echo stone?"
Her eyes snapped toward him.
"How do you know that name?" Before he could answer, the scanner emitted a piercing alarm.
Blue fire suddenly burst from the center of the smooth stone circle exactly where the old vision in Asgard had shown the cloaked figures performing their ritual.
Tourists screamed and stumbled backward. The guide shouted for everyone to retreat.
The blue flames rose several meters into the air before twisting into a narrow column that pointed toward the northern mountains. Then the fire vanished as abruptly as it had appeared. The ground fell silent again.
No smoke remained. No heat lingered.
Only a faint glowing symbol had been burned into the stone.
Kale stepped forward immediately.
He knelt beside the mark and ran 2 fingers across its surface.
The young woman watched him in disbelief. "You can read it?"
"Yes."
"What does it say?"
Kale stood slowly.
"It's not a message." "Then what is it?"
"A direction."
"To where?"
His gaze lifted toward the distant snow-covered peaks beyond the valley.
"To whoever wants me to follow." The tourists, unaware of the deeper meaning, hurried away toward waiting transport vehicles, convinced they had witnessed an unusual geological event.
Within minutes only the guide remained, speaking urgently into a communication device while requesting emergency assistance from regional authorities. The young woman slipped the scanner back into her coat. "You knew exactly what that symbol meant."
Kale nodded. "Because I've seen it before." "Where?"
He met her eyes. "Long before your grandparents' were born." She searched his face, waiting for signs of a joke or deception.
None came. "Who are you?" she asked quietly.
Kale considered the question.
"Most recently?" "Most recently?
I've been called many things." He glanced toward the old oak tree. "Once I was known here as Aldrin." The name struck her like a physical blow. Her journal slipped from her hands, falling open upon the grass. Kale instinctively bent to retrieve it before the wind carried away its pages. As he lifted the weathered book, his eyes caught the familiar handwriting on the first page. He froze. Slowly, almost reverently, he turned another page. More elegant script filled the paper. He recognized every curve of every letter. Ilara's handwriting. His fingers trembled for the first time in centuries.
The young woman watched in astonishment. "You've seen that writing before."
Kale looked up. "Where did you find this journal?"
"It belongs to my family."
"How?" She took a slow breath.
"My name is Lyra Halvar." Silence settled between them.
Kale looked from her face to the journal and back again. The resemblance had been subtle until that moment, but now he saw it clearly. The determined eyes. The way she held her shoulders when speaking difficult truths. Even the small crease that appeared near her brow while thinking.
Time had reshaped the bloodline, yet traces remained.
"You're one of them," he said softly.
Lyra nodded. "Direct descendant."
She looked toward the old oak.
"Every generation keeps one secret.
When the oldest member of the family believes the time is right, they pass this journal to the next guardian." She gently took the book back from him. "My grandmother gave it to me 3 weeks ago before she died." "What did she tell you?"
Lyra looked down at the worn leather cover.
She said the world was changing. That if the blue fire ever returned to this valley, I was to open the journal and follow its
instructions exactly. Kale remained silent. I thought it was family folklore, she admitted. Then this morning.
She looked directly into his gray eyes.
You appeared. Before Kale could respond, the scanner inside her coat screamed once more.
This time the sound was louder, frantic. The display flashed a single warning in crimson letters.
Second echo detected.
The alarm was immediately followed by another message.
Location confirmed, Halvar Estate ruins. Lyra's expression changed instantly. That's impossible.
Kale frowned.
What is? The Halvar Estate burned down over 500 years ago. Apparently something remained. She looked toward the mountains where the ruins lay hidden beyond dense forests.
Then she looked back at the quiet traveler standing beside her.
I don't know who or what you really are. Kale offered a calm smile. That's fair.
She took a deep breath, closed the journal, and slipped it carefully into her satchel. But if you're telling the truth. She extended her hand toward him. Then I think we're both going to the same place. Kale looked at her offered hand for a brief moment before accepting it. Lead the way, he said. High above the valley, unnoticed by either of them, a tiny black crystal hidden among the branches of the old oak pulsed once with faint blue light before dissolving into dust, carrying silent confirmation to an unseen observer that the son of Odin had finally returned to Midgard. The road toward the old Halvar estate had not existed on any modern map for nearly 2 centuries. Official records marked the region as protected wilderness, a place of abandoned ruins and unstable terrain where few people traveled except historians, researchers, or those searching for forgotten pieces of the past. To most of the world, the estate was nothing more than another location attached to an ancient legend. A collection of broken stones beneath forests that had reclaimed what humans once built. To Kale, however, every step toward the ruins carried echoes of a life that had ended centuries earlier yet somehow still remained alive within him.
The forest path narrowed as Lyra guided him between towering trees.
Unlike ordinary travelers, she moved with careful confidence, rarely checking the digital map attached to her wrist. She knew the land because she had studied it for years, not because she had visited often. My family stopped coming here after my great-grandfather's time, she explained.
Why? Kale asked. Fear?
She shook her head. Respect. He glanced at her curiously.
Lyra continued walking. The journal says the estate was not abandoned because it was destroyed.
It was abandoned because it had already served its purpose. Kale looked ahead through the trees.
Ilara wrote that? You know her name. Lyra slowed slightly.
You really did know her. It was not a question anymore.
Kale did not answer immediately.
The forest around them carried only the sound of footsteps and distant birds.
Finally he said, yes. Lyra studied his profile.
What was she like? The question surprised him. Not because he lacked memories, but because so many remained. A person could forget wars, victories, titles, and honors.
Yet small moments often survived untouched.
She was stubborn, he said.
Lyra smiled faintly. That sounds like every woman in my family. She believed responsibility meant carrying everything alone.
Also familiar. She was terrible at accepting help.
Definitely familiar.
For the first time since leaving the valley, Kale laughed softly.
It was brief, but genuine. Lyra noticed.
You miss her. He looked toward the sunlight filtering through the branches.
Yes. Even after hundreds of years? Especially after hundreds of years.
She considered that answer quietly.
I used to think immortality sounded wonderful. Many do. No more fear. No more aging. No more losing people.
Kale stopped walking. Those are exactly the reasons immortality becomes difficult.
Lyra turned toward him. Because you lose everyone else? Because you remember everyone else.
The words carried no bitterness, only truth.
After a moment she continued forward. Then why stay? Kale followed. Stay? In Asgard. Among gods who live forever. Why keep watching a world where everything changes?
He looked at the forest surrounding them.
Because change means people are still creating something new. Lyra glanced at him. You sound like you expected me to ask that. I have had many centuries to think. Convenient. Sometimes. A small smile appeared between them, an unexpected ease forming despite the impossible circumstances.
By midday they reached the remains of the Halvar estate. The ruins rested within a wide clearing where ancient stone walls rose from the earth like the bones of a forgotten creature.
Moss covered broken foundations. Trees grew through former hallways.
Wildflowers surrounded the remains of the courtyard where servants once gathered and children once played.
Kale stood completely still. Lyra noticed immediately. What is it? He stepped forward slowly. The kitchen was there.
He pointed toward a collapsed section of stone. The stables were behind that hill.
He turned slightly. The old oak tree was smaller then.
Lyra stared at him.
You remember everything. Almost everything. He walked through the ruins with quiet reverence. Each location carried a different memory.
The corner where Brenna had once handed him bread. The courtyard where Ilara had reluctantly shared tea with him for the first time. The doorway where she had stood after realizing he was not the man she believed him to be.
Lyra watched him silently.
For the first time she understood that the legend her family preserved was not about a distant god. It was about a person who had actually lived here. Someone who had eaten at this table, walked these paths, and experienced ordinary moments before becoming extraordinary in the eyes of history.
The journal mentioned something, she said after a while. Kale turned. What?
She opened the leather book carefully.
A hidden chamber beneath the estate.
His expression changed.
There was no chamber. Not when you were here.
She turned several pages.
The entry was written years after you left.
Kale stepped closer. The handwriting was undeniably Ilara's, but the date at the top made him pause. This was written 27 years after my departure.
Lyra nodded.
She discovered something.
Kale read the page aloud quietly. The valley still remembers.
The stone beneath our home carries a promise made before the first sunrise. If the day comes when the light returns, the next guardian must seek the place where the roots touch the foundation.
He looked up. Roots touch the foundation. Lyra looked around the ruins. The old oak.
Together they moved toward the center of the estate where the remains of the ancient tree still stood. Unlike the other vegetation around it, the oak had survived centuries of storms and seasons.
Its trunk was enormous, hollowed in places but still alive. Lyra examined the roots carefully. There.
Beneath a twisted section of wood was a narrow gap hidden beneath moss. She removed a small